Good afternoon and thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Simpson. For more than 50 years, the Lake Champlain Committee has provided science-based education and advocacy to protect the health of the lake and accessibility to its waters. One of the Lake Champlain Committee's most respected and recognized programs is the Blue-Green Algae Monitoring Program. To learn more, here's Across the Fence's Rebecca Golland.
For a landlocked state, summertime in Vermont offers all sorts of water-based recreation. The many lakes, rivers, and swimming holes around the state provide opportunities to cool down wherever you are. But anyone who spends time on the water in Vermont knows that the quality of that water can change quickly.
It could be greener than pea soup here on Tuesday, and it could be crystal clear on Saturday.
Mike Roach is a volunteer water quality monitor on Missisquoi Bay. One of the biggest issues for Lake Champlain, and certainly the one that's in the news the most, is blue-green algae.
The title blue-green algae is actually a little bit of a misnomer because it's not an algae, it's a cyanobacteria. It's a bacterium, cyanobacteria. It is a planktonic organism, which means it floats in the water column and can't swim. It photosynthesizes, so it's taking its energy from the sun.
Mike Winslow is a scientist with the Lake Champlain Committee, the organization that oversees the monitoring program. He and his team train volunteers around the state how to spot and identify areas of concern.
They look like a paint spilled on the water. There's no structure to the bloom itself. If you were to take a stick and try to lift it up, it would just drip right off the stick and not stay. Maybe coat it like paint, but you're not going to see any individual stringy things hanging off.
Identifying potentially harmful algae can be tricky because it's naturally present in the lake anyway. And not all concentrations, or blooms, release harmful toxins. The algae can also move in and out of areas very rapidly.
The blooms are triggered by high nutrient levels, high water temperatures, and still water. So we'll get a period of heat wave, you're more likely to see a bloom. You get areas of the lake with higher nutrient concentrations like Missisquoi Bay, St. Albans Bay, you're more likely to see blooms there. Under some conditions, which we don't really understand, the algae produce substances that are toxic.
When the blooms do become toxic, children and pets are the most vulnerable, although anyone can be affected.
The toxins generally cause gastrointestinal illness, vomiting, diarrhea. They can, if inhaled, cause respiratory distress, sort of like an allergy. So you get sore throat, runny nose, watery eyes, something like that.
Winslow says that while toxic algae is, and should be, a cause for concern, the good news is that most of the time, and in most parts of the lake, there is no need for concern.
We received over 600 reports during the 2013 monitoring season, and fewer than 3% actually reported back that they saw blooms.
Those that did see blooms were likely to be in areas like St. Albans and Missisquoi Bay, where shallow water, heat, nutrient overload, and just the right wind direction causes regular outbreaks. Bob Martell lives in Alberg, where he's been a volunteer water quality monitor for 8 years.
72.2. Take a good look at it, the area around, see if there's any algae, any indications of it, check the water temperature, record that, and then fill out the online report.
Martell says that while he hasn't seen the very large blooms that can occur, he has seen a number of smaller accumulations.
We've had some episodes where it maybe stayed around for a couple of days, and then it dissipated, and it was good for the rest of the season, or till the next episode. But there weren't that many.
What are some of the things that you've seen?
I have seen clear water somewhat. I'll show you some of that. I have seen putrid green water that would just stick to you. It sticks to your legs, smells, and it's horrible. I mean, those are the spectrum basically, and anything in between.
Roach and Martell report their observations to the Lake Champlain Committee and enter their findings online for an interactive map maintained by the Vermont Department of Health. Alongside the monitor's observations are data and reports from scientists from around the state as well as New York. This kind of collaboration is key in the effort to keep tabs on the water quality of the lake.
So we're looking at water that people are most likely to be in contact with when they're kayaking and swimming.
Angela Shambaugh is an aquatic biologist with the state of Vermont. She spends a lot of time traveling to sites around the lake, taking samples and testing the water quality. Although the visual monitoring the volunteers are doing can provide a great deal of information, there's no way to tell without testing in a lab what kind of algae is present and whether it's toxic.
I think we probably have more than 150 different kinds of algae that we've documented on Lake Champlain over the course of the time that we've been checking. So the primary data that we collect each year from mid-April through early November is things like phosphorus, nitrogen, silica, chlorophyll, all the kinds of bits and pieces of data that will tell us what the water quality in Lake Champlain is like.
On this day, Shambaugh and fellow aquatic biologist Pete Stengel are visiting several of the 15 stations they monitor regularly.
Lake Champlain overall has really good water quality. We're concerned about it. We don't want it to deteriorate, which is why we do talk a lot about what you can do to protect water quality. We're quite fortunate. There really are only 2 locations on Lake Champlain that have thick, dense blooms that persist for a period of days to weeks rather than just disappearing relatively quickly, and those are St. Albans and Missisquoi Bay. And in those locations are where we have found the toxins at concentrations where we are concerned. Doesn't happen every year, doesn't happen every year at the same time, and that's what makes it so difficult, which is why people are concerned. But in the last 2 years, since I've been coordinating the cyanobacteria program, more than 90% of the reports that we get back each summer show that the water that the volunteers are assessing at their feet and that Pete and I are seeing out on the lake is considered generally safe. It's not that cyanobacteria aren't there, they probably are, but not at concentrations that we're worried about.
The data collected by all of these groups over time gives lake water quality experts the big picture of the lake's health.
We do produce an end-of-the-season report each year that looks at the number of reports that we received, what percentage were Category 1 clear water, what percentage were Category 2 a little bit of algae, which were Category 3 full-blown blooms.
These scientists and citizen volunteers are keeping a trained eye on the water and helping protect the health of the lake, the people, and the economy of Vermont. In Burlington, I'm Rebecca Gollin with Across the Fence.
Well, thanks, Rebecca. We want to point out that there is collaborative funding for the algae monitoring program. In addition to private sector partners, funding is provided by the Lake Champlain Basin Program, the Lake Champlain Committee, the Vermont Community Foundation, and the Lintillac Foundation. Well, joining me now is Lake Champlain Committee staff scientist Mike Winslow. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
So how long has the algae monitoring program been going on?
The Lake Champlain Committee has had an algae monitoring program since 2003. We first started that in collaboration with the University of Vermont and proceeded for a while with a fairly limited subset of monitors in the bays most likely to have blooms. 2 years ago, in 2012, we expanded it substantially so that we're covering the whole lake with volunteer monitors and have a greatly increased ability to know what's going on throughout the lake.
So about how many monitors do you have?
We get 80 reports a week, or this summer, and that's from probably 74, 75 monitors. There are some monitors that do multiple sites.
Mm-hmm. And so are there any parts of the lake that have too little coverage?
There's a couple places where I'd like to see more monitors, particularly in the South Lake, south of the Crown Point Bridge. It's a long stretch of the lake, and we've only had 3 monitors down there. The west side of Alberg, and it's the similar portion of New York, north of Plattsburgh, we have, north of Point of Roche, we have limited number of monitors in those areas.
How does somebody become a monitor?
We go through a training program, so they contact the Lake Champlain Committee, say, I'm interested, give us a phone call, and we'll get you into our database. We have trainings throughout the spring, May, June. We do about 20 all around the Lake Champlain Basin. Monitors kind of have to find where they're going to go because we've got the major sites already covered. So people with lakeshore property or access to the lake are desired there. So they go through the training, then they have to go out on the water. We ask them to go out once a week to observe conditions and report back to us online.
Does it have to be the exact same time of day, or?
We try to keep that as consistent as possible within the limitations of what monitors can do. We know people go on vacation, things crop up. What we don't want is monitors choosing to go out only when it's nice or only when there are bad conditions. We're trying to get a more random sample of what the lake looks like.
And so the volunteer monitors are making water quality observations, but what about the testing part of it for toxins?
Well, you'd mentioned that we started the program in 2003, and for the first number of years, we focused very heavily on toxins. All the monitors collected samples. Those samples got analyzed back at the lab in UVM. And what we found was that the toxin information wasn't particularly useful in informing the public, that it was a long turnaround time between the time the samples were taken and the information got back, and conditions could change drastically. Meanwhile, that lab portion of our monitoring budget was eating up most of what we were able to do. We only had 13 to 15 sites, and that was because we couldn't afford to pay more lab fees. So in collaboration with the Department of Health, we decided to go with a message of, if it's green and scummy, stay out of it, regardless of whether there's any toxins. Dropped most of the toxin component of it and went to just visual observations. The risk that we face with that is there might be blooms out there that are green and scummy but not toxic, and we're not going to be able to distinguish those from the toxic ones. But so we may be closing more beaches, for example, than we would otherwise, but still, we feel that risk is worth taking.
And so how are people most likely to be exposed to algae toxins?
On Lake Champlain, the most likely route of exposure would be swimming in it, or ingesting water as you're recreating, either through swimming or boating if you have spray coming into your face or nose. We don't see much risk through drinking water exposure like we've seen in the Great Lakes. Our intakes tend to be much deeper, but swimming, dermal exposure, and if there's waves and a bloom, then that airborne exposure are possibilities.
So how bad is it if someone's exposed to this algae, blue-green algae?
It's kind of like having the flu. You're feeling pretty nauseous, pretty sick, and as their worst case exposures. There's a dose response, so bigger people are going to take a larger dose to feel those effects than smaller people. So you got the stomach ache, the nausea, the vomiting perhaps. If you're getting exposed through the air, then it's more allergic-like.
So just even smelling it can bother you?
Yeah, it's not the smell. It'll irritate the nasal passages, irritate the mucous membranes around the mouth.
So are you personally more or less likely to swim in the lake after you've been involved in the algae monitoring program?
Well, I first started, before I started studying algae, and I came to the area in the mid-90s, which was right after the first dog deaths reported, and at that time I hesitated about swimming in the lake, but since I've been involved in this and learned more about it, I've become more comfortable with swimming because I can recognize the algae, I can avoid them, take responsibility for myself, my children, my dog, and keep them out when there are blooms, and I know what to look for, and that's why we do this sort of program. And I've found out that most of the lake, most of the time, doesn't have blooms. At the same time, if I'm up in St. Albans or Missisquoi Bay during a bloom, no, I wouldn't go swimming there.
Well, I think that's probably pretty obvious. I mean, nobody wants to get exposed to that stuff.
Exactly. It should be obvious, although we have been surprised that some people, we had a bloom in the Burlington area 2 or 3 years ago, and we didn't get around to shutting the beaches down because it was just at the beginning of the program. We still had a lot of outreach to do, and people were still swimming in the stuff because they said, there's no sign telling me I shouldn't. So people have to take responsibility for themselves, too.
Yeah. But once the bloom disappears, when you can't see it, it's still safe to go in the water then? If
there are no algae, if you can't see algae in the water, the chances of there being toxins are extremely low. So yeah, you have to have those green scummy masses to really expect there to be a risk associated with swimming.
And can you necessarily tell where a bloom's going to show up, when it's going to show up, if it's going to show up?
There's some predictions we can make. If we have areas of the lake with really high nutrient levels and the water's really warm and we have a heat wave, we can predict St. Albans, Missisquoi Bay are going to have blooms. There are other blooms that are just going to pop up and disappear within a day or an hour or rarely a week, so those are a lot harder to predict.
Before we go, how can people learn more about the Lake Champlain Committee and the citizen science opportunities?
Well, our website is www.lakechamplaincommittee, all one word, .org, and our phone number is 658-1414. Contacting either of those will give you lots of information about all the things our organization does.
Well, I want to thank you for joining me today.
It's been a pleasure.
That's our program for today. I'm Judy Simpson. We'll see you again next time on Across the Fence.